Golly, how is everyone doing? I am so excited for this stream. I've been working on this idea for quite some time. I just had the title in my head, and it took me a while to think of the proper panel to bring together for this. And over time, I found, I think, the perfect group of fellas to discuss this. We're talking about how to take down an NGO. Now, from the start, I just want to establish, and maybe this is my error as a host, but when we say take down, this is nonviolent, this is completely legal, and we're going to be discussing strategies for how to address or disrupt non-government organizations. And I've gathered Reactionary Reading Law here, and I'm just going to throw up some links here. So Reactionary Reading Law can be found at reactionaryreadinglaw.substack.com. We're going to be looking at a couple of these articles during the stream, but I would encourage anyone to look that up on your free time as well. We've got the great Yuri Bezmenov. Now, I've been a fan of Yuri Bezmenov for quite some time. Needs no introduction. One of the biggest names you're going to find on Substack. He's writing, it seems like almost daily articles. How I did not rip this title off from him, but it is. I like the how to do this or that. Very, very great stuff in there. We've also got a good friend of mine by the name of Ben Fleming. You can find him here at Radio Free History. I've known him for quite some time, and you would be, Ben Fleming, because I don't think I've had you on the show before. Would you say you're sort of well-traveled in the areas of corporate litigation or anything like that?
I'm not a lawyer, but I used to live in Washington, D.C., so I know the people firsthand who serve on the boards and work for these organizations.
And of course, reactionary reading law, your specialty. I'm not going to talk too much about your legitimate businesses here, but much of what you've discussed is about lawfare, the topic of lawfare. And within, I would say, the UK context, mainly, because...
mainly the British context, but also the American context, because in the American context, the term lawfare isn't a dirty word. It's an academic line of discipline. So in my book and some pieces on my Substack, I discuss it from an American point of view as well. But mostly it's a British thing that I focus on.
Yeah, and everyone here has got their regional interest, and everyone's got their opinions on NGOs. Or a lot of people think they know what an NGO is, or do they? I was just going to discuss, maybe my background. Or for people who don't listen to the show, I work in marketing, and at various points in my career and my wife's career, who also works in marketing, we've worked with NGOs. And there's a lot of different types of NGOs. In fact, I'm going to pull up something here. This is interesting. So this is just wango.org, but it's a worldwide NGO directory. And you can segment it based off of whatever the region is. We got North America in front of us right now. And so total organizations over 23,000 in North America. That's what it looks like, showing 1 to 50 on here. And there's a whole spread of NGOs. That's kind of why I was getting that. So when you say NGOs, some people think, civil rights organizations. There is that. But then there's, Missouri Coalition for the Environment. I will never use Tobacco Incorporated. There's all kinds of shit out there. So you got these racial or ethnic ones. The Irish got one. The Italians have 30,000, right? There's all kinds. Then there's, the CASA program, 1687 Inc. I don't know what the fuck that is. Anyway, just to give you an idea of the spread. Now, in my capacity, in my wife's capacity, we've dealt with some good ones. There's anti-drug ones, but there's more than a few that are dedicated to stop child sex trafficking internationally. If you want to hear an interesting story, I'm not going to announce any names or get anyone in trouble, but one of the most interesting engagements we had was there's many anti-child pornography, child sex trafficking organizations, and we're dealing with one, and they were interested in getting into India because India, I don't know if you all know this, has a huge problem with pedophilia and child rape. So does every country outside of Europe, basically, insofar as that world doesn't come into Europe as well. But this doesn't get brought up, but there's organizations that are saying, we'll come in for free. we'll give you basically free money to help you bring awareness to this, set up an infrastructure to stop it. And in every instance, they've turned them away. So they're actually denying, and they could say, oh, they don't want Americans on the ground in there. Yeah, maybe there's that, but it's everywhere. The free help, they don't recognize that that's even a problem. And these NGOs are all staffed by liberals. They're all staffed by well-meaning progressives and stuff. So they can't just say that's a problem with India. It's like, oh, they haven't been educated enough. They're sort of the managerial. This is like the top of the managerial class. This is the aristocracy of the managerial class. You spent your entire life in academia. Everyone's got master's degrees. Everyone's got doctorates. And they're the leaders of these organizations that it sounds good when they're at a dinner party. They get to say, I'm on the side of social good. And I'd say 70% of their job is begging for money. Now, does that sound accurate? Maybe it's good to throw it to everyone else. What do you think about NGOs? Do you have any personal experience with them, or what do you think the problem is with them?
Yeah, well, I think the first part of countering NGOs is to reframe them in the minds of the public, because the average person will think about nonprofits and NGOs as charities, and these are places where you donate money and volunteers go out into the world and help make it a better place and help people who are struggling. But that couldn't be further from the truth. These are huge money laundering organizations and idea laundering organizations for leftist commissars to execute on communism and their worldview without any real oversight from the government. So I think before we get into the nitty gritty of legally how do we do this, we have to win in the court of public opinion. And I think over the past decade, more and more of this rot has been exposed, where tons of dark money is sloshing around. The commissars who run these organizations are making huge salaries, mid six-figure salaries, while barely doing anything. And I think in America, where I am, we saw a lot of this happen with the Biden open borders, where these migrant organizations were taking billions of taxpayer funds and essentially conducting human trafficking with them. Tons of children have been lost. No one knows where they all went, but these NGOs are at the heart of all of this subversion and demoralization.
Yeah, Ben, or Reactionary Reading Law, what's your view from where you're standing? I know, Ben, you're in Canada, Reactionary Reading, you're in the UK. What's the lay of the land of the NGO situation there?
Well, like I said, I'm Canadian, but I used to live in Washington, D.C. Now, if you've never been to D.C., a lot of people have, this incorrect, image of what the city is. D.C. is a city filled with corporate lawyers who it's their whole job that the second a new law is passed, they have to figure out what that law means for their stakeholders. So usually you have some corporation based in Nebraska or someplace. They have their few corporate lawyers in Washington, D.C., either to work as lobbyists or to be able to interpret a new law the second it's passed and say, what does this mean for us? Now, a lot of these lawyers end up working for NGOs, which are quote unquote consulting firms. And it's their whole job to use or to interpret these more social justice based rulings and regulations to shake down corporations who want to do business. And they say, there's these new environmental rules and regulations that are getting passed, and it would be a shame if you had a $2 million fee because you don't listen to our lawyers who can tell you how to interpret this new law. That's the one type of NGO that there's a lot of in the DC area. The other one is some rich guy. He's making all sorts of money. You know the image of the rich guy's wife who starts a business that loses $10,000 a month because he needs to get his wife a keep her off my ass hobby.
Do I know it? I had one as a client.
Well, there you go. You'd be surprised how many power couples in DC are where the guy is one of these high-powered corporate lawyers and the wife makes $200,000 a year running one of these vanity project NGOs that's supposed to sit on committees and raise awareness and whatever the fuck else they're supposed to be doing. A large number of these NGOs, especially the social justice oriented ones, you'd be surprised how many of them are just the vanity project for the wife of some rich guy.
I was going to ask that, and reactionary reading law, I'll throw it in a second, but maybe incorporate this. How many of these NGOs, as we've just discussed, are done cynically, meaning that they're just straight up money laundering, it's busy work for some hoe, or how many people actually take it seriously, do you think, versus it's just some strange dark money thing?
From the UK perspective, and from what I've seen with either left-wing NGOs or any other NGOs, it really depends, because the way that NGO money is given in the UK is it's normally goes through some very large charitable trusts that may or may not have some links to the UK government, and some NGOs may get some money off the government. But normally, a lot of NGOs that work, for example, for migrants, seem to be quite decentralized, but they're actually not. So what will happen is you will have an individual left-wing NGO that does social justice in a given area, and it seems to be a decentralized thing run by local people. But when you dig into their finances, you find out that, it gets this amount of money from the Open Society Foundation, it gets this amount of money from the UK government, and it works as an advisory basis for X local council. But that's why charting the NGO structure in the UK is so hard, because many of these very small NGOs, or seemingly very small NGOs, work for a bit of time, and then when people suss what they're up to, the NGO is folded within itself, and then it's replaced by another NGO. And that's something that I've noticed is quite common globally for a lot of awareness raising or activist organization NGOs. Does that answer your question?
It does. And I have a follow-up question, and this is probably unknowable, but for anyone who's looked into it, you mentioned the Open Society Foundation. A lot of people know what the Open Society Foundation is, but would they be one of the biggest players, or do they just have name recognition? Like, once you kind of get into it, how prominent are they, would you say?
In the UK, I'd say they're less prominent in America, but in the UK, I can't name any off the top of my head because I haven't got notes in front of me, but there are loads of organizations that are very large charitable trusts that you probably won't have heard of, that control vast amounts of money that gets given out to these smaller, more localized NGOs. And you also have the larger charities that are name recognized, like the Red Cross Foundation and Oxfam, that will be involved in some kind of NGO stuff to do with something like providing aid to migrants. It will just be through a partnership as through a larger organization.
Absolutely. I'm just going to throw up this image because you had brought something up very interesting there. So a lot of people have seen this. I don't know what people think about Data Republican. I know there's a lot of people who might have a thing or two to think about them, but we covered this on the show quite some time ago. How money flows between NGOs and through various trusts and organizations. And one thing you can notice, and just to visualize what you're talking about, one NGO goes away and another takes its place under a different name. Maybe it's the same people involved every time, but who's actually moving money around? If you just look here, the interconnectivity of all these societies and NGOs and foundations and think tanks, and it's $31 million here, $410,000 there. So when people say the Open Society Foundation, I say, yeah, my suspicion was always, yeah, that's one, but I just pulled this up on a charity graph here, and there's already, look at this mess. You could drill down even or take the microscope and place it somewhere else, and you would need to disrupt this entire web And one of the best examples, I love this, just going over this. Anyone can find it at datarepublican.com. Obviously, it's going to be within the American context, but you'll see a lot of investors, private investors, or even, their groups, and all these lines go to one black box, and it'll have some nondescript name. And so you don't know what's being done there, and then it distributes all this stuff. It's like an amplifier or something, and it has the environment rather has all of these nodes that are made to obscure who's specifically given money or who it's going to or who's involved, and that it strikes me that that's by design. It can only be to cloud who's actually funding this stuff. Because they could say, like, oh, we receive funding from 100 different people. Who's to say which individual actually funded Black Lives Matter or this environmental thing over here?
Yeah, these are all slush funds. And I think the bulk of nonprofit funding comes from two sources. The first is the left-wing billionaires that we all know and love, like Soros, Gates, Pritzker. A lot of times their funds are intermingled together into these networks like the Arabella network and the Tides Foundation, which is all connected to Open Society and Soros. And then on the other side of it, you have government funding. Yeah, that's the irony of being called a non-government organization, is that many of these places get the bulk of their revenue from the government. And in the US, Doge has cut a fair amount of it, but there's still tons more to go. And we saw USAID being the biggest example of an organization that got gutted, and we're still seeing the chain reaction that came from that, because all of these propaganda sources, lots of activist networks have gotten much quieter and virtually disappeared after Doge went in there and took out USAID as well as a bunch of other of these groups and funding sources. So yeah, I mean, it's all either coming out of the taxpayers' pocket, which is us, or these huge left-wing billionaires. And I suspect we will probably see a fair amount that are going to be connected. I hope the patriots in control of this administration are going to just take out this network root and stem, following what happened to Charlie Kirk. And for sure, a lot of these trans radicalization and Antifa groups are getting some of this dark money.
Yeah. Can I ask a question?
Of course, yeah.
Right. So in the UK, because we have local councils who get some central government funding, but also get funding from local taxes, which is meant to be spent on things like taking the bins out, maintaining infrastructure, and so on. How does state governments show up in terms of the funding of left-wing NGOs? Because in the UK, it's quite a prominent issue for local councils to be funding your left-wing NGOs or your ethnic interest group NGOs and spending quite a lot of money on it. Does anyone know anything about that?
Yeah, that's a great point, RRL. That's exactly what happens in America as well, because we have a very federalized system. The federal government does provide a lot of this funding, but you also have states and cities that have huge budgets. The budget of New York City is $10 billion. And the reason why many of these cities have deteriorated is because you have this crony commissar network where the mayor and their staffs are all extremely far left, and they contract out the city or state budget to their friends who run these NGOs that try to attack homelessness or do things to help protect migrants from deportation in the sanctuary cities. So we see this happen in every major American city that has fallen apart, whether it's San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York. Zoran Mamdani is going to win the election in a few years, in a few months, barring a miracle. So, yeah, all this to say that local and state level governments that are controlled by the communists are definitely doing this.
Well, I think that almost even understates the issue. You think about urban corruption. 50 years ago, it was the mafia and the organized crime groups doing it. Now, all that corruption is in the form of the fact that local and state governments outsource everything to third-party consulting firms, even the honest ones. Like, how do you trace everything through this web of shell companies, some of which are perfectly reasonable because somebody needs to form a shell company to invoice his consulting hours. The idea that everything happens at City Hall hasn't been true for a long time. Everything is outsourced anyways.
Absolutely. And one thing, just to, we're going to move into ideas on how to take down an NGO, obviously. But I know a few people had mentioned that, as we were just discussing, you can take down an NGO, but the real culprit is the dark money network. So in a sense, if each NGO has a mission or a task, and yes, maybe it's ending homelessness, maybe it's getting AOC elected or whoever, but the one thing I'd said on the show a few times, and this might sound naive, but it's not, is that a group of 5 guys can do pretty much anything. You can disrupt any organization. You can perhaps toxify a narrative. And so you can maybe take down one of these smaller NGOs. Let's give one example. The Canada Anti-Hate Network. And this is kind of going to answer Reactionary Reading Law's question about, I guess, how blatant is the funding, because I've seen on X individuals who are just posting their grant requests. So you have an organization like the Canada Anti-Hate Network, which is, again, I think really they've got a board of directors, but it's like 3 to 5 people in a room. And one of them is a boomer, and he's the guy who set it up. And he's got his little minions. All they do is they write blog posts about, white people doing bad things and try and get them in trouble. That's it. That's what a lot of them do. But, you can look up where they get their funding from. And sometimes they post that, here's me asking for money from the Canadian government. And the Canadian government will openly say, yeah, we gave $900,000 to this group for their work, their good work, which again is literally just writing blog posts and being online. So at least in Canada, there is no shame people feel by being open about how they're asking for this. And it comes directly from the government in the form, not even of loans, but just of grants. And they have money set aside for this express purpose. And so, and Ben, I know you've only been in Canada a little bit, but what do you think about it? Does that kind of gel with what you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if I have anything to add to that. It's all on the government website, their registry and their records of the amount of money they're giving out. I don't know if I have anything to add to that. I completely agree. It's explicit.
And just to gravitate towards this here, just to let people know that it is possible. I just have a couple of articles here. Here's one from Manchester, To Die a Good Death. The story of NGO closures. This was published in 2023. But there's a few graphs in here I'd like to call people's attention to. Which NGOs are most likely to face closure? They got a database of 898. You got here how many were dissolved based on the size class. And then you've got over time dissolved NGOs versus all NGOs. And it seems that the closures were increasing. Now, this isn't because of political agitation or any sort of, ideological attack. It was just that they couldn't prove that they should exist, because so many of them, and this is what I was getting to before, so many of them are dependent on one single source of revenue. Now, there's all that dark money, the big data Republican network, of course, that's hard to disrupt. But there's a lot of these small to mid-level ones where their express purpose is to make your life miserable. That's it. To get you debanked, to get you fired, to get your family to hate you, to isolate you from your friends and family. So maybe we can't solve the problem of the entire web of treachery, but there might be a way for a group of 5 guys, 5 committed guys, to legally attack these smaller ones, and maybe that sends out reciprocating effects. Maybe that shows people that these NGOs aren't so powerful. And maybe the narrative can shift, that people stop taking them seriously. Because I can't say, especially where we're sitting in 2025, if anyone takes NGOs seriously. But look how many can close. All the dissolved NGOs broken out by region here. And here's a feel-good story from Geneva Solutions. Half of women's rights NGOs brace for closure over aid cuts. Women are sad in the world. Yay! But
Back in the kitchen, ladies.
a year of for people who are listening to audio, a year of drastic foreign aid cuts is pushing hundreds of organizations advocating for women and girls' rights to the brink, says UN Women. And I know Yuri's going to find this interesting. There's a part here that says it's almost entirely due to Trump. It's entirely due to Trump turning off that spigot, because it was just America that was funding most of them. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say it goes a level deeper than that. It's that the elites in every country around the world, they send their kids to the Harvard Kennedy School or to Harvard Business School, where they network with the people who are going to be working at these American charities and NGOs and whatever, so that they spend the rest of their professional careers, going to the UN and knowing who they have to approach with their hand held out for foreign aid money. It's if you were to close down the Harvard Kennedy School, I would bet that a lot of this network would completely collapse, because that's the pipeline that gets people into the network. And I don't mean on the United States side, I mean on every other country that's receiving this money.
Well, really, I've never heard about obviously, I'm a dummy. Can we talk a bit about the Harvard Kennedy School? That would be a massive hub of this, is what you're saying.
Well, it's on the American side, it's what trains everybody to go work for the State Department. And for every other developed country, it's what trains their diplomats to go, like I said, hat in hand to the UN. And hey, I know John Smith from my time back at Harvard when I was 24 years old, and now he is in a position to dole out these these foreign aid funds. And I'm going to talk to this guy, and I'm going to get a loan for $3 million.
Oh, look, they have programs on how to do a nonprofit. That's interesting.
Exactly. Like, this is one of the nodes of the network.
The Harvard Kennedy School is like the Star Wars cantina of demoralization. Yeah. The people who come out of that are running color revolutions and NGO agitation all over the world. This is their training ground. But I mean, to get back to the topic about how do we counter all of this, I think one part that is still critical to understand, especially when it comes to normies and winning public opinion, is like the NGOs are very clever at naming themselves in a way that manipulates language to make them sound good. So you pulled up an article that talks about women's rights, and of course, women's rights are human rights. And many of the largest NGOs focus on this idea of human rights, which came from the UN Charter after World War II. And this has been weaponized as a narrative to essentially open all borders and subvert any national sovereignty. So a human rights NGO, and there's millions, but the biggest ones are going to be the Human Rights Campaign, HRC. There's the IRC, International Rescue Campaign. There's Amnesty International. So all these funds that talk about human rights, what that really means practically is that they're going to fight tooth and nail to never deport anyone, no matter how heinous of a crime they commit while being an asylum seeker or something like that within America, within Europe, within Canada, the UK. It's all the same people, and it's all the same tactics. So the one big part is to continue to push back on this narrative and expose what these words really mean in their propaganda. And then,
do you think we're winning on that front? By the way, do you think?
I think we are. I think we are. As more gets uncovered, it becomes impossible to ignore. Yeah, I think the other heinous thing that happened over the past week was Irina Zaritska's murder in Charlotte, North Carolina, and it's been uncovered that the MacArthur Foundation gave a $3 million grant to the county that Charlotte is in to reduce the prison population in the name of equity. So what that means, if people, normies can even understand this, right? Like, they are letting violent criminals out of jail, and these people go on and slash the throat of innocent young women just sitting there in a train car. So the more of these incidents that occur and get exposed, the more that the tide of public opinion is going to change. And then, that's very much connected to the second major pillar of what we need to do, which, I don't know how this can happen in Canada and the UK, but in America, we have the RICO Act, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. And the irony here is that this act in 1970, some of the first major accomplishments was to take down the Italian mob. And we're hoping that this is also, this statute is also used to uncover this entire web of connections in the NGOs that you can trace direct funding that lead to direct crimes, and things like Charlie Kirk and Irina Jarutska. It's all tied into this flow of money and this agenda that's gotten people hurt and killed.
Now, I've never heard it described like that before, but it seems so obvious now, especially with the Zarutska case. And I believe that, I'm not sure this was verified, but the judge in question, that black lady judge, she had some private dealings with an NGO herself that had interests in mental health awareness. So there's this idea that
she didn't have a law degree at all, number one. Number two, she was running like her own little mini NGO. There's tons of these too. It wasn't like a big NGO that she was affiliated with. It was, I think, a very localized one, a small one. But of course, that means that she will directly profit from the sentencing decisions that she gives. It was like a halfway house or some kind of criminal rehabilitation NGO.
Now, that's an interesting narrative to really drive. And I think there's some people doing that right now, which is we must do something about these borderline retarded black lady judges. Because, I would hear stories for years from America mainly, but all these like lower circuit court judges where you don't need to pass the bar. You don't need to do any of this. You can actually just like apply off of fucking LinkedIn and get a job as a judge, and then they get to feel good. They get to say they're a judge, but they have no legal acumen, really. And they're obviously, there's videos of this. They post this shit if you look it up, and there's some people who do content based on it, but you can see how they're trying these cases, letting off repeat murderers. They seem to express, racial solidarity with a great many of these. But to me, I like the idea of taking a RICO Act approach to show that, look, treat this as a criminal organization, treat this as profiteering, and rip some of this out by the roots. And I think we can get people there. At least there's a window of time where people are so invested in the case like Zarutska, like we got to find who's responsible for this. And maybe we're not going to take it all the way to the top, but there's a couple organizations that, like, if you just keep people on it, I think you can do some pretty extreme things.
If it's not going to happen now, then it's never going to happen. After what Irina and Charlie, the public support is there to go as hard as possible and quickly. And yeah, the Biden regime appointed hundreds of these red guards in black robes across benches in the country. And you see them pop up every time there's a nationwide injunction filed against Trump. You're like, oh, you can't deport this illegal alien murderer because random diversity hire Biden judge says you can't. It's totally insane. And then this magistrate court that was involved with Irina is probably the lowest of the low. And another shocking update in the case. This is a white male judge, I believe, but he had previously released this monster that killed Irina. And once again, he has actually taken this man out of a prison and into a medical care facility. And God knows what's going to happen when the defense is going to try to make a case that he has mental illness, so he can't be prosecuted. Maybe he'll get released or a much reduced prison sentence than what he actually deserved. This is ongoing, yeah.
On the sort of medical, or someone being granted as medically insane and incapable of standing trial, because the way this works in the UK is quite interesting, and I think the way it works in the UK is better purely and simply because we do have quite a lot of people who are in mental hospitals for the rest of their lives because they're dangerous. So one of the most prominent examples you may have heard that may have found its way across the pond is the Nottingham stabber. Basically, he's a guy who was from some foreign descent, went crazy and started stabbing some people in Nottingham and killed, I think, 3 people. He was convicted of manslaughter because the court found that he was too insane to have been found guilty of a crime. So he couldn't be done for murder because the intent required for murder just wasn't there because he was insane. But a lot of the criticism from the British right of this judicial decision was he's going to be put in a prison cell. He's not going to be put in a prison cell. He's going to be put in a secure mental hospital. And a lot of the criticism was he should be in a prison. But to be fair, that guy, as far as I'm aware, is never going to be let out of a mental hospital. And from what you guys have been saying, it sounds like in America, people, when they're found to be unfit for trial because of severe mental illness, they can be let back out. How does that work? Because I know in some cases you can theoretically commit a crime under temporary insanity, and then because the court decides that you didn't intend to do it because you're insane or you have diminished responsibility, you can theoretically get away with the crime. But as far as I'm aware, that doesn't happen.
I don't want to speak for the Americans, but I will. We covered this really great book on the show quite some time ago by Thomas Zaz called The Therapeutic State. And this was a doctor. This is a man who came from the world of psychiatry who was criticizing, starting in the 60s and even before, sort of the psychoanalyzation of America specifically. But an interesting sleight of hand occurred where you saw many progressives advocate for the closures of asylums. And this happened in the 80s, all throughout America and in Canada. It was seen as inhumane, just imprison the mentally ill. So they just released them in the public. And at the same time, there's an increase of deeming people mentally ill, almost counterintuitively. So, even the Zarutska case, the assumption was mainly from black people, but others like, this is a mental health crisis. You hear that all the time. You never hear that excuse given to a white perpetrator, but you hear that for everyone else. Well, he obviously went insane because no sane person would do that. But what do we do with the insane people? And that's a very murky area legally. So you can say he's going to spend the rest of his life in a high security place. I mean, that's really up to the doctors. That's up to whether or not they deem them sane or whether or not it is still seen as inhumane to keep them there. There's a lot of flexibility in that, and that's kind of the point. And so people can be quietly released if they're deemed no longer a threat to their community. And of course, they can still be, but it gives a lot of power to psychologists and psychoanalysts, and it's relatively unchecked. And it's normalized us psychoanalyzing each other. And so that's kind of creates this whole parallel legal system where, people see it as a get out of jail free card, because it basically is, especially in America. And I'll throw this to you in a second, Yuri, but I was talking about this in our community the other day, that they'll say it's a mental health crisis or the mental health issue. Okay, well, what is it? Are they schizophrenic? Are they bipolar? Do they have floating anxiety? What is it? You never fucking hear what it is. And the go-to they have, especially for black individuals, is, well, it's the legacy of slavery. So that's almost a permanent mental health crisis that they're allowed to deploy whenever they want to justify. And
Like
they
Trump.
they won't overtly justify it, but let's say, oh, I mean, it's understandable because of slavery. It's coded into it that we can never understand his mental state, but who's to say that he can't move past it? So, I mean, technically they could be let out. So that was just a bit of a tangent. So I'll let everyone else
Yeah, in
respond.
the UK, it's a slightly different system because for someone to have the mental incapacity defense, it has to be proven in court. And if it is deemed 10 years later that they could theoretically be released from a secure mental health facility, for that to be the case, for them to be released, it has to go to a judge directly.
That's interesting. So I guess, Ben or you, do you have any thoughts on what's it like on the ground in America with the mental health epidemic you're seeing?
That black woman who stabbed the kid to death in the parking lot, and she got off because she was incompetent to stand trial. So not even insane. Like literally, this woman's IQ is too low to understand what she was doing was wrong, and that's that's a floodgate I don't think anybody really wants opened.
Too stupid to
No.
understand not killing children. And that's something you say, and that's something, just to circle it back to the NGO thing, like there are nonprofits and charities that are advocating for us, that are putting this into the zeitgeist. And so, aside from the judges, there's juries who are willing to accept this. Not even, ethnically aligned juries, but you get a jury full of white liberals and they're going to tell you the same thing because they're just in this culture.
Yeah, there's a technique called DARVO, which is deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. That's essentially what's happening here, right? Because even the mayor of Charlotte, who tried to cover up this video from even being released, she went in and said that we should feel bad for the murderer. Yeah, he's just had such a tough time, and we have to tackle this mental health crisis. So this whole system, and this man is a product of it. He's probably just spent his entire life on welfare, and one NGO after another is going to help him. There's probably a homeless NGO that's giving him food and shelter. There's mental health NGOs. There's anti-racism NGOs, and they're sucking in money to justify their existence to help people like him avoid any real accountability and punishment. So you could definitely say that blood is on their hands. And this is just something that's so beyond insane. It cannot and should not continue.
I got a question for the panel. Just as broadly as possible, what do we think about NGOs generally, in the sense that, do we think there's such a good thing as a good NGO, or should this entire system not exist?
That's like asking what you think of a shell company. I mean, how much of corporate America is based on a shell company, that has a PO box somewhere that holds some critical asset for some bigger company? Like the phrase NGO or the term NGO, it can mean so many different things that I don't think it's even a meaningful question. Is an NGO, like, what does the O stand for? It stands for organization.
Well, I guess that answers that. Sorry for the dumb.
Well, I mean, I just think it's too broad of a question to answer. I mean, in my opinion, at least.
It's true. Like I was saying at the start, I'm sure we could think of a couple good ones. It seems that the money would flow towards. I mean, I guess it's a chicken and the egg question. How much of the money is because people emerge from academia with these dreams of forwarding these topics, and they ask the most money and then they get it, or versus government trying to prop up these organizations? So I mean, academia is involved as well. We just showed that one school. It's so funny to me that someone would go to post-secondary education to work in an NGO. They would take a class in that. Like I was reminded the other day that people can go take specific programs to be in the CIA. I'm like, oh, it never occurred to me that you can go to school for CIA, but of course you can. I just thought they picked up right-wing commentators. Here's an example I want to give, circling back to how to attack an NGO. Now, this was a pretty famous case, not long ago, right around the time Musk took over Twitter. I'm looking at Keith Woods' Substack right here. He was instrumental in popularizing this hashtag BanTheADL. And this is a good Substack. I encourage people to look at it. This is sort of a debrief of the whole situation. He's got evidence here of here's how popular it was, millions of views. It was trending. Everyone was talking about it. And there was real talk at the time that this could really damage the ADL's reputation, the Jewish Anti-Defamation League, for people who don't know. And I won't read the entire thing here. However, I think it was very interesting. The question, however, is, with hindsight, at the time there was talk about, what can the ADL do to survive? They've never received this much public backlash before. And even we were speculating that, well, I mean, they could just cycle out some leadership. I don't think the organization will get hurt significantly, but maybe they'll offer up a sacrifice. I was somewhat surprised that literally nothing happened. There was no reckoning. There was no sacrifice given, which isn't to say it wasn't successful, but I just wanted to use this as an example of the narrative was achieved. It was part of the national conversation. Many people were on the side against the ADL. However, does this show the limitations of populist support for these narratives, or is this just part of the process? Is this just a stepping stone to get where they might want to be to dismantle the ADL? I know this is more in your wheelhouse, Yuri, but I leave this open to anyone.
I go first, please.
Oh, yes, of course.
Right. So from what I know of the BanTheADL campaign, it was mostly a campaign that went on Twitter. And if I could turn to a UK-based example, which is Hope Not Hate. So for those of you who don't know, Hope Not Hate is a UK-based charity that basically does a similar thing to the ADL. And
oh, yeah, yes, I've heard
that,
of it, yeah.
Basically, they attack people and produce reports on people who are right-wing. They dox people, so on and so forth. But Hope Not Hate as an organisation is also advising the government and got caught advising Reform UK and other parties as to who their candidates can and can't be. So one arm of it basically goes after right-wingers, and then the other half of it also advises, or used to advise, on things like counterterrorism, candidate screening, and so on and so forth. Hope Not Hate, much like the ADL, for years now has had lots of bad press. But the problem is, and a lot of this bad press was done by investigative journalism from people like, regardless of what you think of him, Tommy Robinson and The Restorationist and other people as well. But for the most part, the backlash against Hope Not Hate didn't really get anywhere in of itself. And the reason for that is the action against something like Hope Not Hate, and I would suggest ADL as well, was online people moaning about the problem on Twitter. And it didn't actually people didn't actively organize and take further action other than complaining. And I think part of the reason for that is it's boring. Like, dealing with NGOs, complaints processes, and even if necessary, hiring lawyers is expensive and it's really boring. But organizations like Hope Not Hate probably could have had something done about them earlier, because it's alleged that they have broken, not by me personally, but by other people who have, such as The Restorationist and people like Tommy Robinson, it seems from a lot of the investigative work that those people and those organizations have done on Hope Not Hate, that they've been breaking quite a few laws and maybe even some criminal offences. For example, there was a video that formed part of a documentary by Tommy Robinson that an allegation was made that Hope Not Hate employees were bribing homeless people for information on certain right-wing people with drugs. And you've got lots of those sort of skullduggery tactics that Hope Not Hate have been accused of, with some proof, not necessarily convincing proof, but some proof at least, and basically nothing happened with it. And the impression I get is the same thing is true of the Stop the ADL campaign, because it stays online and it doesn't do any further action.
Now, if I could just interrupt. So Yuri and Ben, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I need to run to the washroom for 2 seconds. So you guys, ban the ADL. Where do you think it went right? Where do you think it went wrong? And just kind of talk on that for just a second.
So I think you need to know the financial situation here, because I don't know how much organizations like the ADL and Hope Not Hate are the sources of money that other people are expecting. If they're like the sink, if that's the end of the line where all the money ends up, then nobody cares. They're just going to ask the government for another check, or they're going to ask some billionaire for another check to keep the lights on. The bigger issue is if one of these organizations, if they're an intermediate that are going to be giving money to somebody else, that can be part of a larger money laundering scheme And if the fundraising dries up even a little bit, then they can't pay money to people who they owe, or they can't pay money to people who might be expecting that money, and that's something that could lead to a domino effect. I just really don't know enough about the financial positions of any of these organizations, but how much money they have and how much money they owe and where the money comes from, that's just as important as to what they're actually doing themselves.
Wasn't Hate Not Hope the organization that doxed Raw Egg Nationalist?
Yes, it was.
It
Yeah.
was.
I think Morgoth as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, they doxed Morgoth as well. They've doxed quite a few people, actually.
Yeah, and it does seem like they get a fair amount of funding from the U.S. as well as operational support.
And
You
the
know,
British
I've talked.
government as well.
I talked to Raw Egg, where it's like the way they found out his personal details just seems like almost impossible to do unless you had some extra access, potentially by an intelligence agency. But I mean, to go back to the question here about ADL and just in general how you get these organizations to wither away, it still goes back to the money. And one other propaganda tactic that they use is that they claim that they have huge organic grassroots support, that most of their funding comes from good, virtue signaling little people like you. So sometimes you'll get mailers, or you'll see these people in the streets in a city where they'll come up to you and say, hey, do you want to contribute $10 or $20 to women's rights or human rights, blah, blah, blah. And they make it seem like a large part of their operating budget is coming from individual small donors. But, just like their politicians on the left, they say that, but when you actually dig in, the bulk of it is still coming from deep-pocketed billionaires or the government. So until the sources of funding are cut off, then you can't make a huge dent, which is why public opinion goes hand in hand with this, because you need to vote in governments that are going to take action, both stopping the flow of taxpayer money and actually prosecuting those that deserve to be prosecuted. And I see a good message here from Brother Moonfrog. I like the name and the avatar there, but it appears that this topic is top of mind for the most important people right now, because Vance and Miller are talking about this exact thing. And they're the ones who are going to be able to execute on this. And I can't think of two better men to as a tribute to their dear friend and our martyr Charlie Kirk, to finally put an end to this, because this has been festering for easily a century, maybe even more.
An interesting example here, because I think what they're really going after is Antifa. And Antifa, at least in my perspective right now, is at a nadir of its popularity. Antifa, we watched this movie the other day called Eddington with Joaquin Phoenix, written by Ari Aster. And it's about the COVID lockdown. It's about a lot of things, but it's kind of the first movie I've ever seen about that period, even if you don't like it. But it's kind of unique in that sense. But what I noticed was Antifa, as depicted in that film, was seen as a bunch of, and I don't think this is true, but seen as a bunch of naive young people who are almost appropriating social causes. And sure, there is that as well. But just something I noticed is that there's more people not taking Antifa seriously, laughing at them, talking about them like they're a bunch of gay losers. That they're not exactly, and they're not really taken seriously. So I do wonder, and this is kind of what Yuri was getting at, which is, if you look at the people who are actually in control of this, I think they're on the brink of just cutting them off entirely, because they've become so toxified by not only the public discourse, but also all of the crime that they're attached to. They're always going to have a stronghold in some sense in Portland, but maybe not. And that's an interesting case where is the money just going to divert to something kind of like that with more or less the same intention? But also, I'd like to see Antifa ground into fucking dust. I hate them. They're responsible. Like, they're laughing at Charlie Kirk being shot in the neck. Like, they're reprehensible people. And even though some will say, well, this doesn't attack the root cause, I'm like, yeah, but I want it to happen. I want hope, not hate. I want everyone to be fired. I want everyone to be, I want to see everyone who worked at Hope, Not Hate open a fucking OnlyFans. I want to see these people homeless, and that's like a selfish, ugly thing that I have, but I own it. I think they deserve it. Fuck them. They've been trying to like mutilate your children's genitals for 10 years. Call it petty. I'll be petty, you know.
I certainly agree about going after people personally, because the problem with the NGO structure is that there seems to be a trend in the UK and in the US whenever one of these left-wing NGOs that's been funded by the billionaire dark money network gets themselves into trouble, whether it's they do something seriously illegal or they just get so much bad press that the brand is toxic. Normally it's a small NGO that will just collapse, and the people involved will do basically the same thing again, but under a different name. And that's happened with quite a lot of NGOs that have been involved in some quite serious wrongdoing, let's say. So one of the examples I've got is about some years ago, Lauren Southern, in a documentary she made on the issue of mass migration to Europe, got somebody who was running a project for an organization called Advocacy International, I believe, and on video advising these illegal immigrants to lie about their background. So, say they were gay, say they're from a different country, so that they could get awarded asylum. And that's something that's illegal. It's something that, if there was the right organization, people could be better held to account for. And by that, I mean the lawyers who do it and the people involved in those organizations who give that advice either getting struck off or going to prison. And there are examples in the UK of lawyers being struck off or law firms being fined, not insignificant fines, in some cases millions, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds, for advising asylum seekers to lie. And this is a sort of ray of sunshine, if you will. It can be done. It's just very hard and boring to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this has to be comprehensive. You have to salt the earth and take out every layer of this, because in the same parallel with the mafia, RICO was made so that what the problem they were having is that they would just catch the goons that are doing the crimes on the street. But if you round up a couple goons, you're still not going to really damage the organization, because there's going to be plenty of new goons that they're going to bring into their organization. And what you really have to do is go higher up the chain. You have to take down the made men. They flipped a lot of those guys, and then they finally got to the dons. And only when you have the dons imprisoned and checkmated, then you can actually declare victory. Because as long as they're out there with their money and their checkbooks, these things will pop back up down the line. And that's why it's critical to do that, because these things are set up for that reason, to insulate people from any legal accountability, because they can just say, oh, I just wrote a check, like I thought I was giving it to a good cause. I didn't know it was going to get then funneled into people running Antifa Discord channels, or those random pallets of bricks that show up on the street randomly. They can just play dumb and plead innocence in that way. But you just have to make sure that you flush this all out, you gather all of the evidence, because all of us know, like, if you just pay a slightest bit of attention, that these things are all connected. You just have to show the public and mete out the justice that's required.
And to that point, I think now more than ever, there's regular people who are willing to enter into that discussion, because the average person, they know about the Open Society Foundation, which means they get the premise. They get the idea that there's this massive conglomerate that is seeding all these, you might even call them color revolutions throughout America. Similarly, you've had the Data Republican thing. And a lot of people are looking at the Data Republican map because they're tracking taxpayer money and trying to see where their taxpayer money is going. But I'm like, don't forget that. Just look at where the money is going generally. So I think there's more people now who kind of get the premise that we're establishing that they couldn't before. So, with the ADL, And I'm not trying to, throw any shade at Keith Woods, because I think, it did as well as something like this can do. But the problem with the ADL, and the reason nothing happens, because if you hypothetically brought down the ADL, whoever is funding the ADL would just start another sister organization, and then the public would kind of forget about it because they think they've won. So you do need to go one step up, attack the money. But now you're entering into a very difficult conversation about where's the money from these Jewish advocacy groups coming from? Yeah.
I think that the regime is almost one step ahead of us on this one, because the Gavin Newsom campaign almost seems like a rebrand. It seems like they're getting ready to get rid of the old cohort of goons who probably came about in the Occupy movement in the early 2010s. I think they almost want us paying attention to the last group of, Antifa people from 2020, the dirty flea bags. If we want to pay attention to them, it's not even that they're going to get rid of those old foot soldiers and find some new ones. I think they're already trying to push those people out the door. The Occupy Wall Street cohort of left-wing activists, they're all a bunch of losers facing down middle age now. That nobody looks at them as being the cool kids, the next big new thing. Yeah, I think they're already on their way out the door.
Well, I think that's a good point you made, which is, on our side, at least on our show, we're always trying to look ahead if we are being granted a win. And I do think, JD Vance is out there hosting Charlie Kirk's show, talking about we're going to go after them. The sell-by date by Antifa is probably over, but where is that energy going? It has to go somewhere. So I'm curious on where it's going to be, because, like you said, they're going to get a lot of the obvious foot soldiers out, all the crust punks, all the, trust fund girls with the fucking, swastika, the cross through it, all those t-shirts. Like, those were always losers. they didn't move the needle, and they just sit in struggle sessions in, reclaimed buildings. They didn't matter. But I'm interested to see where that money is going to go, because you have to consider what the money thinks. And really what this entire stream about is looking at the money, following the money, and asking the question, can you wage a foot soldier style war against NGOs that is treated something like voting? Your vote doesn't matter, of course. These NGOs don't matter, but with enough support and enough strategy, can you disrupt it enough that it sends a signal to the money or to the power that maybe their well-being is threatened? By well-being, I don't mean their lives, but they need to change what they're doing with their money. So perhaps you could, through another avenue, cause enough chaos and confusion that it creates some, reshuffling of decisions higher. What do you think? Or is that small potatoes too?
I think you can possibly, because in my experience with looking at how funding is given, especially by organizations that have very large budgets, not much attention is paid to where it's going as such. So it is theoretically possible to put pressure on people saying, oh, you're funding this, this, and this, and stop them from funding whatever they're funding because it's too much of a headache for them. I know that some of the extracurricular stuff I've done behind the scenes, local councils have accepted and stopped funding organisations because people have complained about it. And it's just been a case of a couple of people writing well-drafted complaints saying, look at what this organisation is responsible for. Why are you funding them? But with the specific NGOs, I think it's slightly harder. So it depends what sort of money you're going after, because the way that you go after the funders when you're talking about a local or national government is different to how you would go after the funding if it's coming from a large multinational foundation.
Yeah, I've got just an article here from Yuri Bezmenov's Substack. This is first in a series of how to fire a commissar. I just thought it was thematically relevant. He's profiling 10 incompetent identitarian intersectionality shields. And I was always reminded of how much the managerial class is essential for this. And I wonder, and we would need to project in the future, how much of this money is driven by boomers and boomer wealth centralization, all these investments. So, I assume many of these boomer liberals they're culpable. They know what they're donating to. There's going to be one day soon where there's no more boomers, and that money will relocate. And I wonder, this NGO strategy, do you think a significant amount of it dies with the boomers? And if there's fewer younger generations going into school, even pursuing NGOs, are these NGOs just going to wither away? Or will the money just relocate somewhere else entirely aside from these, or effectively like shell companies or make work schemes for these people? Or, will the people who have money maybe decide to use it differently? That's a very big question, but I'm just curious what your thoughts might be.
Yeah, that's probably the most important part, is to change the sentiment of this class, this very small elite class of people who have been the primary backers of these NGOs. And the question about is the money going to go away once the boomers phase out? No, because a lot of these funds have gotten so big that they are an endowment. And that endowment, just like a university's endowment, can sit there and run its operations just off of its interest and returns off of whatever investments they make. And of course, the next generation up and coming, I think Alex Soros is the scion of what that might look like. You still have these people very much ingrained and indoctrinated in being far left and thinking that that is the cool thing to do with their lives because they've never had to work a day in their lives, and daddy handed them billions of dollars to take care of, and that's what they're going to devote their life's work towards doing. So I do think it's going to be a challenge because those people are the most insulated. They never interact with regular people. They are completely tone deaf and not understanding the damage that they are causing, and they only surround themselves with bootlicking court eunuchs who are going to tell them that they are so wise and morally and intellectually superior. So, I mean, when it comes to what can we do, I do think we have the right people in place in America to affect real change. And even though most younger lawyers have come out of environments where most of them are going to be far left, the few that I've met that survive that crucible and are dedicated towards the West, they're ready to battle. This is the one battle that they've been waiting their whole lives to fight. And they were, a lot of them were somewhat taken off the field by all the lawfare that went on during the Biden years. They tried to actually attack Trump's lawyers to make sure that they could never practice again. And I've known some people, or have indirect connections to people who went through that. But there's a lot of fire in the belly right now, and with guys like us and just regular citizens, never stop posting. Go in and make a noise locally if you find something that is causing harm to your community. And then when it comes to this Commissar series that I did, the one that actually made a big change was the one I did on the NPR CEO, or former NPR CEO, Catherine Marr. I think I was the first that dug through all of her tweet history and started posting it out there. So it still is one of my most widely read pieces. And you saw the entire preference cascade play out, because then Rufo picked it up, New York Post, and then it just steamrolled from there to the point where now she's finally been fired and NPR has been defunded. So a great example of a victory against one of the worst NGOs out there.
I love success stories. And that's why I don't want people to be demoralized. And it's very easy to become demoralized once we start talking about huge, big money donors and things like that. But like I said at the start, I keep this restricted to what our people could do immediately. What can you and your friends do? And it might not solve everything, but could you do, like you did this? Look what you did. You started a preference cascade. You got one of our worst bitches fired. That's not nothing. That feels good. Not only does that feel good personally, I'm sure, but the reciprocating effects of that let people know that this sort of thing is possible, I think that contributes to a vibe shift, whatever the fuck you want to call it. So, I don't dismiss small victories. And if there's one thing maybe people take away from this, that this isn't something you need to wait for someone else to do, because like I said, I don't think these NGOs are particularly powerful. They're run by dummies. Like I said at the start, I worked with these people. I did not work for them directly, but I was sort of on an email chain with one of those. It wasn't Hope Not Hate, but it was one of those like anti-extremism NGOs. And it's run by like these aging Gen X women. They don't know anything. So to them, their top targets, their top threats in the United States were like the KKK and the Christian identity movement. And these haven't really been relevant since the 90s, early 90s or the 80s. Like the KKK doesn't fucking exist in any real capacity. But in their minds, because they've watched so much Netflix, they think that's the main. They don't have the finger on the pulse of anything. So, on one hand, you've got these people. They get a lot of money, but they're quite stupid, and there's not a lot of them, and they can make a lot of noise, but they're not very Machiavellian. They're not very cunning. You can outsmart them. You can look. If you ever encounter their emails, they write like the biggest fucking retards. Entire emails written in the subject line. Name a bad behavior that these types of executives could have. They have it all, but they also are highly egotistical. But they know that they're dancing on the razor's edge all the time, because anytime that spigot can be turned off, then they got to go work a real job. Then you got to get like a 65-year-old Jewish woman who's got to learn how to do underwater welding or something. You know what I mean? Like great. But I think they're more vulnerable than people think. And there's just a part of me that thinks that you can trigger, we talked about preference cascades. I think you can trigger a widespread preference cascade against these types of NGOs, because I just think people are there. What do you think?
Yeah, you can't underestimate how dumb and lazy these adversaries are, and they are weak. They're scared. They're seeing the momentum is no longer on their side for the first time ever, and they're continuing to make big mistakes. So if you look at the arc of the past decade, the people in this room were just scattered guerrillas, and they were picking us off one by one, throwing the weight of their entire machine around. But we finally built this feedback loop that goes all the way into the upper reaches of the administration. This again unprecedented in history, where random anon posters and people who use their face, all these people have finally forged the right relationships and networks to bubble up change and sway minds that really matter in short periods of time. So we have to keep this newly built machine humming, and also make sure that we get patronage of our own, because if there's one thing the left is good at, it is rewarding their allies with patronage and throwing money at the problem to achieve this horrible utopia that they think they can make and socially engineer. So now that we finally reversed course on this, I think this is the final missing piece, is to make sure that all of the guys on our side are well taken care of, so that they can do even better work. That this is a virtuous cycle that is starting to take off. Just needs a little more fuel.
I agree with you on it's not hopeless, but the concern I've got is, in the UK context specifically, the funding networks just aren't here at the moment. There's lots of people who might chuck some money at our circles for a party or something, but actually building organizations that are long lasting and do the good but boring and necessary work to fight back against this stuff is just non-existent. And I'm not saying that there isn't things that people can't do on their own. There certainly is. But for it to be in any way long lasting, it needs to be more than a hobby for people. It needs to become professionalized. For example, there's stuff that can be done that in some cases I talk about on my Substack, in other cases I've dealt with it privately. But lots of strategic action that is to flaunt the work of these NGOs, or in some cases, actually stop them from getting what they want or going after the NGOs or the people involved, can be done. It's just very boring and it revolves people thinking years ahead. So I'll give an example, which is homes of multiple occupancy in the UK. So in the UK, for the past 5 years or so, we've had a problem with the boat migrants. Has everyone heard of this?
Yes.
Yep.
And they get put in hotels. And the reason they get put in hotels is because there's nowhere to put them. So because there are so many of them, they used to just get put in the really shit, nasty hotels. But now, because there are so many boat people who've come into the country, they get put in hotels all over the country, in some cases next to schools. And there have been like multiple rapes, multiple alleged sexual assaults, all confirmed as well. I'm not naming names. There have been multiple criminal offences of a serious to minor nature, which makes the lives of the locals a living hell. But because this policy of putting these people in hotels has been so unpopular, basically from the get-go, what's happened is the government has had a strategy for years of moving these people into homes of multiple occupancy, HMOs. So for those of you who don't know what I'm on about a house that is for multiple adults living together. So that would be something like a student house. And what's happened in some cases, you need permission to operate a house of multiple occupancy off the local council in the UK, and it will be varied depending on the local council. But in some areas, people have been able to stop migrants from being moved into their areas by stopping the council from awarding permission or a license to the management companies for the refugees who are subsidies of the home or contractors for the Home Office. That'd be someone like Serco, G4S, those type of people. And that type of work can be done and it can achieve things. For example, there are areas in the UK where they don't have an illegal migrant problem, and that's great for them. But the problem is attacking the problem of these illegal migrants not being in your area is the type of thing that requires some kind of formal organization, really, and planning years in advance.
Yeah, it reminds me of this individual, and his name escapes me, and I wish it didn't, but he was a millennial last year. It was his first time, and he might even be Scottish, but he's from the UK somewhere. And his whole thing was, I believe he was a lawyer. He might not have been, but he was just going to these town council meetings where an Islamist center was being built. He had to propose it, and people vote on it, and he would just go and fight it in whatever the local council was, and he had a whole string of victories. And this is just one guy, and I think maybe he had a team with him as well, but just one guy taking time out of his day, no material reward, it seems. But look what you can do. You can just, you can cause problems for these in your community, in your neighborhood. And this sounds like an old head solution, of course, but no one takes these sorts of things. It is boring. No one takes it seriously. No one wants to do it. But just to cycle back to what I was saying at the start, if you can get a couple friends together, I think you'd be surprised at how you can. Oh, sorry, did my mic cut out?
I still hear you.
Okay, good. Sorry, it just gave me an alert. So anyway, I'll wrap this up fast. You'd be surprised at what you can accomplish with just a few people. It doesn't need, and if you can get a string of successes under your belt, maybe that becomes attractive to patronage and to investment. Here's 3 to 5 guys that got a couple of, metaphorical scalps under them. Maybe now you're real. Now you're a force. And then perhaps someone with money, maybe it's a Christian nationalist. Maybe it's just a right-leaning person with money says, oh, I hate woke NGOs. Let me throw, $50,000 behind this to get results. But maybe you got to start getting results on your own for free and then seek that out, or maybe it snowballs. I don't know. That's just one idea.
Yeah, you bring up a good point in that
sorry.
I mean, we should just also realize that there are NGOs that are ostensibly on the right, but they have been wholly ineffective. They raise a fair amount of money. I've seen, prominent right wing wealthy people give lots of money to these right wing nonprofits and think tanks, but they have nothing to show for it. They don't achieve much results. They just write a bunch of white papers, hold a conference, and pat themselves on the back. It's this asymmetry where the left versions of them are actually getting things done for their people, but the right is just content to have a couple nice banquets, fly around and talk at some conferences and call it a day. While the random anon shit posters on Twitter are actually getting things done and operating, as doing it as like a side hustle without making any income, while these guys are sitting lavishly in DC or wherever else, claiming to be defending conservative values and right wing causes, but they're not achieving anything of note.
Well, not only that, if they actually manage to get their way into the system, a lot of them get assimilated into the board pretty quickly. But I just have a question. You mentioned earlier about Alex Soros and being surrounded by a bunch of his boot-looking eunuchs, is the phrase you used. How long do you think that system can propagate itself without external funding? Because, I mean, Alex Soros, if he gets any money, he's getting money from people who are paid by the managerial system themselves. Do you think that this system can propagate itself for a significant amount of time? Or do you think at some point the money needs to come from somewhere? Like George Soros, he made all of his money from his hedge fund doing sketchy foreign exchange trading deals, crashing the pound in the 90s. How long do you think that this network can propagate itself if it's not getting money from some external source? Do you think it can propagate itself for generations?
Yeah, I mean, these people have so much intergenerational wealth that they will never need to raise any outside capital or donations. Off of $1 billion, if you just generate, let's say, even 5% conservatively, compounding interest on that every year, that means that you'll have $50 million to work with per year. And that's what Alex Soros and the the next generation like him are having to work with. So they can hire hundreds and hundreds of Antifa and bootlicking court eunuchs to do their bidding, and none of those people will ever tell them, hey, maybe we should reconsider this. Maybe you should see what happens when you write a check for an NGO that's going to reduce the criminal population. It gets to the point where you don't know when that line has been crossed between ignorance and pure malice, because we've just seen so much evidence of the direct causal effect of what they're doing. And then you look at the like this giving cause thing that a lot of the billionaires have put their weight behind, where they say that they're going to give away 99% of their wealth and only leave 1% on for their kids. Well, that's very much a propaganda spin too, because they're just parking it in these foundations that escape taxes and are ultimately still managed by their children, most of whom are far left like Alex Soros. So they make it sound like there's such amazing charitable people, but if anything, it's worse, because they're not giving money to that helps people directly. They're just handing it off to an army of professional managerial class people who are going to continue on this never-ending stream of NGO demoralization.
It is funny to consider that it would be better if they just dumped it all into UNICEF, or to save a panda or two. But they're raising these criticisms of the younger generation and said, well, I'm just going to give all my money to my gay communist daughter, which is so much worse. Sorry, I guess I killed the room with that one. Okay.
I mean, there's a great example of this. It was I think it's called like Charter Communications or Cox Enterprises. It's like a big company in the U.S. that was family owned, and one of the descendants set up an Antifa training compound in Western Massachusetts. So yeah, I mean, this happens all the time. I think the MacArthur Foundation is also a big example of this. You know, the guy the patriarch who started it was a billionaire back when that was a huge deal, almost a century ago. And after he passed away, he handed off his money to this MacArthur Foundation, and then his son ran it for a while, and his son was very much for the left, even though his father was a great uh, American patriot and nationalist. And what do they do with this on top of the grants I mentioned earlier about releasing criminals? Every year, it's the most prestigious thing among intellectuals is the MacArthur Genius Grant, and they give 25 people $1 million, no strings attached, just to do their work that is they consider to be genius. And if you look at the people who win this award, and I did a deep dive from the last cohort, it's all just hardcore communists. And yeah, I think Ibrahim Kendi is the most well-known example of someone who won a MacArthur Genius Grant. But these are people who are doing the ugliest statues possible, or trying to get more people released from prison. This is now who the MacArthur Foundation considers to be a genius, worthy of showering with money.
It's so funny. It's like, where are all these horrible statues of fat black women coming from? Oh, genius did it.
Yeah. You just trace it right there, and you see how this whole network operates.
It is so funny. I know there's a lot of people who are critical of conservatives and Republicans, but it seems to me that the rich liberals, they give their money to their trans children, and the right-leaning rich people, they just give it to the ADL. Like, you would love it if the rich conservatives gave it to their far right or radical or their groiper grandchildren or something, but they never do. They're the only ones that actually do what they say they're going to do, which is give it to, they spread it around to Greenpeace or some bullshit. The liberals don't do that.
Yeah,
billionaires don't even invest their money in new companies. Left-wing billionaires invest in a bunch of woke Silicon Valley stuff. Like, forget the NGOs and the charities. Right-leaning billionaires, if somebody makes his money in, I don't know, oil, he's only going to give any of his money to new oil companies. Forget the public sector, forget the charity sector. Even in the private sector, you have that problem.
And I think that might be a good place to end as any. We covered everything I wanted to cover. I do need to get going right about now. I got to go pick my son up. We got a couple of our people here who are in a different time zone entirely. But I just wanted to thank everyone who took the time to tune in at an odd hour, the middle of the day for us over here in Canada and America. And also for those who took time out of their day on the panel to be here. I just wanted to thank you profusely. I'm just going to throw up a couple of plugs once again. Here's Ben Fleming's Substack. This is Radio Free History. That's a Substack, YouTube rather. So,
YouTube,
yeah. Check out Yuri Bezmenov's Substack. Great many fans already, but if you liked what you heard here, you're going to get even more detail over there. And Reactionary Reading Law.substack.com. We barely got to his discussions. We touched on it a couple of times, but he gets really deep into the value of strategic lawfare. What are the pros? What are the cons? What can actually be accomplished? And of course, if you're here watching this, you know what blood satellite is. And if you didn't, you know now. And I just wanted to open it up to any closing remarks, anything you might have wanted to get out there, but you missed. I throw it to the floor.
Nothing from me.
I think we talked about everything I wanted to go over.
Yeah, I'll set it here. Thanks for hosting us, Dimes. This was a great group, great discussion.
Yeah, thank you.